the most effective propaganda is actually not things that are demonstrably false, but it's actually the selective curation of which true things to tell you.
Hello and welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Marcus Harrison Green.
And I'm Nora Kenworthy.
Nora, I think it is safe to say that in the time since our last episode, reality has continued its steady pivot from deeply concerning to quote unquote, are we sure this isn't satire written by a bored incel?
Ugh, it definitely feels like we've entered the I don't know, maybe we've been here for a while, but the everything is breaking phase of capitalism,
Oh, yeah.
and not quietly cracking. I mean, the ice is snapping beneath our feet. We've got warehouses burning, billionaires getting a little too close to their own consequences, and people in the comment sections talking like, "I think the system is the problem."
Yeah, we are definitely at the point in our late stage capitalism where the peasants revolt, I would say.
Yes. Or the influencers, depending on where you're
That's
looking.
one and the same. It's
Uh,
interchangeable.
no, but it's like it's really not fringe anymore, and it's not just one ideology kind of lining up. People across the board are like, "Heck yeah, something is very, very wrong here." It keeps reminding me of our really prophetic conversation with Charles Douglas III when he said, "It's more the politics of the top versus the bottom than the left versus right," and, like, spoiler alert, we're all on the bottom.
Yes, yes, we are. You will most likely stay there as opposed to being a millionaire at this point. But anyhow, um, so Nora, like, can you let our listeners in on what exactly happened with this billionaire burning thing? Or
Oh my god. Oh my gosh. It's been so much this week, Marcus.
there has been.
Here's the short version. There have been a string of attacks tied to worker anger, with one of the most visible being a warehouse set on fire, although I think someone also threw a Molotov cocktail at Sam Altman's house this week.
Ah, yes,
Um,
that is true. Forgot about that. Yeah,
can't forget about that one.
it's a Tuesday. It's a Tuesday.
I know.
Anyway.
But basically, people have been saying, sort of like, essentially, you could have avoided all of this by paying us a living wage.
That is as about a clear a thesis statement as you're going to get, I would say, Nora.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I think what's striking isn't just the acts themselves, but the reaction. People are not surprised. They're just kind of like, "Yep." And
Right.
not to endorse violence, but saying like, "Yeah, this didn't come out of nowhere."
Right, and I don't know, instead of asking why are people this desperate, the response from the powerful is immediately, "Oh, this is domestic terrorism," which
Of course it is.
is very convenient because then you don't have to talk about the fact that people are being squeezed to the point where they feel like they have no options left.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it really feels like the powerful are developing like some very substantial amnesia about cause and effect. Like, oh, wow, people are angry after decades of stagnant wages and predatory healthcare systems and vanishing safety nets, and then just being told to like work harder and try harder while billionaires are playing in space for fun. I mean, shocking.
It is truly unforeseeable. Yeah, no one could have predicted that telling people their lives are disposable might eventually, I don't know, upset them.
Yeah, you would think that the billionaires with all of their fancy bot tech tools might have predicted this a bit better. Um,
You would think, yeah. That's
I guess those bots are too busy rubbing their egos.
mm,
But like it reminds me, it actually wasn't that long ago when Luigi Mangione, I guess we should still say allegedly, I'm not sure,
yeah, yeah.
shot the United Healthcare CEO. I that felt like a flashing red warning sign, and the fact not just that it happened, but people's reaction wasn't just horror, it was like, "Well, it's complicated." We all kind of hate the insurance companies, and I just wanna be clear, like, no one is endorsing the violence, but people are endorsing the sense of desperation that I think leads to the
Absolutely.
violence. I mean, the system itself feels violent.
Right, I mean, I think to point to the cause and effect isn't to your point to say or to cheerlead on violence, it's just to say that this is A has led to B, and, when people start saying this is nuance about something that is very clearly not supposed to be nuance, right? Like the murder and the burning of buildings and throwing Molotov cocktails, for example, that is a signal. That's society basically saying, we've lost trust in the moral framework that you've been selling us all these years.
Yeah.
And by the way, that you haven't adhered to, but you want us to adhere to.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we have been marinating in this kind of structural violence for so long, and it just feels like it gets worse by the week. And it's interesting, like when something like the Luigi Mangione event happens, the system responds for like 5 minutes. Insurance companies were like, "Uh oh, I guess we better
Right.
approve things now." Like, we don't want that smoke.
Right. It's so wild because it's like, oh, you could have been doing this the entire time.
Those were just choices. Yeah. I have, a student who's working with me, who's in Canada. We're working on a paper on American healthcare system, of course, and
Oh, wow.
she's like, "I feel like Americans don't like in health insurance. Like, they just don't seem to wanna buy it." And I was like, "Yeah, because it's a scam." Like
Right. Yes, there's a difference between health care and health insurance, you know?
Yeah, like, we understand that there are, like, catastrophic consequences if we get really sick and die, but also, like, the health insurance itself, like, doesn't protect you.
Not at all, no. No, it
Um,
truly is a racket. I know we make fun of this particular centimillionaire all the time, Scott Galloway, but he recently said something about how I mean, and this is a privilege too, by the way, how he, like, doesn't actually have health insurance because he's rich enough that he doesn't need it, right? There is no medical catastrophe that he couldn't afford right
yeah,
now, to
yeah,
pay for, and it's like, that to me, that says everything you need to know about health insurance as a scam, anyway.
yes, yeah. So, I mean, and this is only one dimension of what's happened this week. Do you wanna talk about AI?
Oh, yeah, I mean, how can we not? I mean, it is the future, supposedly.
I mean, there is a
Uh
reason there's, things being thrown at Sam Altman's house.
There very much so. I mean, when you have our powerful tech overlords basically saying, "We are going to replace your jobs, and there's nothing you can do about it," maybe some folks are going to maybe get furious and irate about that. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, it does feel like we're constantly being told, "Don't worry, the future is coming. It's also inevitable." And by future, they mean you're unemployed, the grid is depleted, water is disappearing for cooling data centers, and rent is still due.
Yeah, and we have no viable option, for you other than just to suffer, I guess, maybe consume, and then just die, right?
Yeah,
And also, by the way, you probably don't have enough money to actually consume, so it's basically just suffer and die.
yeah,
So, yeah, I mean, how are any of us supposed to be excited about this quote unquote innovation, right? I mean, if it just is continuously if it seems to be nothing but deleterious to our future. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Disruption is profit for them and suffering for us. And so I guess we're being told good luck in this economy.
When aren't we though, Nora, right? I mean, it's felt like that for I don't know, time immemorial, right? But I think that's the through line here, to be honest with you, right? It's not just the anger; it's that people feel like this deal, quote unquote, has been fundamentally broken, right? I mean, I was looking at a study about social mobility in the United States, and it's I think I guess you know better than I do at this point, but I guess it's been worse in the United States than it has been in the UK for some time, and the UK has historically, right, been a sort of more or less, for lack of a better term, sort of dynastic.
Yes, locked into their class, identifications.
Right, right. I mean, the whole promise of America, right, is like well, maybe not anymore, obviously, but you can come here and, if you can and, you don't have to have any type of, connections or family wealth or whatever, and you can make it, and that is, proven to I mean, I think it was, for the most part, fairly a fairy tale for, for
Yeah, like,
time
remember when we used to
forever, yeah.
believe in trickle-down economics, Marcus?
I
Those were the good old days.
I don't know if it was all of us who believed in that, but it was certainly it
It
certainly
was some of
imposed
us.
upon a lot of us. But, anyway, I'll say, Nora, it does seem like we are approaching another tipping point, if you will, that I think we've maybe tripped, fallen, and are now just kind of rolling downhill into an unholy merger between church and state at this moment.
Oh god, we have to talk about that too, don't we?
We do, we
Yeah,
do.
we are
I didn't have
somewhere
a great
between
segue for it, honestly, from trickle down economics to this religious, unholy war that is brewing, but here we are. Here we are, folks.
they're both a scam. Um, no, I think we're somewhere between, like, biblical fan fiction and low budget apocalypse cosplay this week.
Oh my god,
As
yeah.
I'm sure everyone knows, we've got the President of the United States having an actual beef with the Pope.
Yes.
Worth noting, the Pope is calling for peace. Uh, and Trump is escalating a war that absolutely didn't need to happen after getting mad for not getting a peace prize, and
God,
then
yeah.
is posting AI images of himself as Jesus Christ.
Which, to be clear, he did later clarify was actually him as a doctor, because a
Mhm.
doctor wears, I guess, holy robes
Yeah.
and, has the sunlight of God descending, from heaven on him. Yes, anyway.
He's a doctor like RFK Jr. is a vaccine scientist.
That's Jesus.
I mean, the only thing he's healing us with is, like, m magic light and vibes. I don't know, the prescription here is clearly harm.
Well, I will say he is finally a man brave enough to practice malpractice on an entire nation,
Mhm.
Nora. So there's that, I
Yeah, I think he's
suppose.
been doing that for a while. Um, and, like, it's worth noting that actual diplomacy with Iran is collapsing in real time. Obviously, we sent in our best man, JD Vance, last known, for diplomatically, maybe causing the last pope to die. And, surprise,
Oh man,
surprise, peace talks fall apart.
he is the epitome of a walking plague. I
I
think,
mean,
Nora. He's the
I
personification, I should say,
I
of it.
know, I know. Every time they send him in, it's like, the prediction markets tank. Anyways, he's out here saying two can play at that game as if this is like trash talk at an LA Fitness pickup game and not, a situation with nuclear weapons and gas markets and, civilization on the brink.
Well, Nora, there's nothing that calms a global crisis like a guy who sounds like he just got cut off in traffic and in a fit of road rage decides, you know what? Fuck it, let's blow this whole thing up. Maybe literally, unfortunately, for the entirety of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to remind folks, there was a deal. Obama
Oh,
got it.
that's right.
It was a
That's right.
nice functioning deal. It was a nuclear agreement that kept things relatively stable and also kept the Strait of Hormuz open until they just tore it up. So a lot of what we're watching now is less unavoidable conflict and more entirely preventable sequel.
Yes, this is very much the Fast and Furious of foreign policy. We just like blew past logic around part three, and now we're just here for the explosions. I don't know, we're at maybe part seven, Iran diplomatic drift or something. I don't, it's,
Fast and Furious
yeah.
of foreign policy is something I never wanted to hear come out of your mouth.
We do live in unprecedented times, Nora.
Except instead of cars flying between skyscrapers, we've got global markets tanking, supply chains, war. So slightly higher stakes, and I think it's fair to say the plot is worse.
Only slightly, I'd say. If you have never seen that series, it's kind of maps on with what's going on, I would say, to a T. But anyway, while all of this is happening, Nora, I keep coming back to this question. How do we end up in a place where someone behaving like this, meaning what our president is doing, still commands deep loyalty from religious communities? And I am looking straight at you, evangelicals and Roman Catholics who claim to value humility, compassion, and moral clarity. Like,
Yeah.
what is going on? What is
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, there have been some Catholics who have spoken out and some
Mhm.
Christians who have said this goes too far, but I find it interesting that Trump posting a picture of himself as Jesus is going too far when this is a guy who was found liable for sexual abuse, who lies constantly, who has killed many innocent people. I mean, it's baffling.
Yeah, he who does not welcome the stranger, and I believe Pope Leo had pointed
Oh,
to the
there's
fact
that
that
too.
that the Gospels say to welcome in the immigrant, essentially, and we are certainly not doing that right now.
Not doing that. No.
I
Um,
the cognitive dissonance around this is just it's staggering to me.
yes,
Um,
it truly people are, like, twisting themselves into theological pretzels, to make this make sense.
yeah, and this is where things I think get weirdly instructive because once again, as has been a recurring theme of this presidency, you've got people defending institutions they would normally critique just because Trump is attacking them.
Yeah, it's that lovely moral whiplash that we've all been dealing with. It's like, I don't love the Catholic Church, but I guess I'm on Team Vatican now?
Yeah, I think it's as somebody who was a fan of Game of Thrones, I think it's the Game of Thrones logic where you're looking at it and you're like, yeah, this person is objectively a sociopath, but my God, have you seen the other guy? Like
Yeah.
that's yeah.
I mean, and the danger here is that we actually start losing our ability to hold multiple truths at once.
No, exactly, because I mean you can look at the Catholic Church, and yes, it can be a moral voice on war, but it can also be an institution that has caused profound harm. And both things can be and are very much true.
Yes, yeah, of course, that kind of nuance doesn't exactly trend.
Well, Nora, speaking of things that don't exactly trend, like
Mm.
systemic harm, structural violence, the everyday machinery of inequality, that brings us to something else happening this week.
Oh, yes, it is our favorite bipartisan tradition, powerful men behaving badly. Everyone knows about it and no one says anything.
Yeah, so two members of Congress, Eric Swalwell and Tony Gonzalez, have resigned over misconduct. One was a Democrat, one a Republican. They were very much equal opportunity disappointments. Swalwell actually was also running for governor of California and pulled out. And I got to say, I don't know if this is, you know, proving that we've come far or not, but I was in California, living in California in 2003 when Arnold Schwarzenegger was running for governor, the actor and bodybuilder. And at the time, there are all of these stories about him groping, women and all these allegations, I should say. And it was like a blip. It was like literally 5 minutes. That the story was like 5 minutes, and then he ended up becoming governor, and then winning again. And now you have all these stories about Swalwell. He's somebody who has stepped away from both Congress and running for governor. And so I don't know, maybe some things have changed for the better in these 2 decades. I don't know.
The thing that makes me just, like, rage as a woman, though, is all of these Democratic male they're always men,
Yeah.
leaders who are now going on, cable news and being like, "Oh, well, everyone knew.
Yeah.
Everyone knew.
Yes, that
He's
was
been
the
terrible forever." And I'm like, "Then why didn't you get rid of him?"
particularly I got particularly in a race and again, as somebody who lived in California for a little while, I'd never understood how the governor race works, where it was what they call the jungle primary, where essentially thousands of people could run for governor and it goes to the top two. And so you can easily have a situation where even though that's a Democratic state, for or at least has been, historically in the last, 4 decades, that you have Republicans win with like 2% of the vote. But
Yeah,
anyhow, so you would think just at one, yes, he should have absolutely not been in this race to begin with. But number two, you would think at the very least it'd been like, okay, let's get rid of some of the more problematic people to make sure
right,
that there's no way that
right.
anybody as equally problematic can potentially win this election. But
You don't back your wild card, guys.
not at all.
Um, I mean, I guess nothing unites our parties in this country like the inability of powerful men to keep their hands to themselves.
Not at all. And the fact that Gonzalez and Swalwell, to your point, I believe they had stories about them in, whether there was whispered, or whispered amongst the political elite and or online or so forth about their conduct. And yet
Mhm.
these are people who, like with Swalwell, still decided to run for governor, right? And
They
Gonzalez,
let him, basically. I
right.
mean, like, let's not pretend that there's not, like, a fairly strong organization behind these front runners, that's choosing who's gonna be endorsed, right?
Exactly, and I mean, the fact that they had the gall to continue to continue to either stay in office at a time or continue to want to run for governor. I mean, I think that says I take back what I said. I don't think we've I don't think we've come that far at all in the sense that they were still willing to they knew that they had all of this stuff in their past and were still like, the level of sort of entitlement and hubris is just kind of galling.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but here's the
Ah,
thing, it really feels like a week where I'm sorry to say it, Marcus, but powerful men, their scandals, the sensational headlines, they are really dominating the coverage and sucking up all the oxygen.
yeah, I don't think that that's a time where they aren't, unfortunately, Nora. But that said, meanwhile, the systems that actually shape people's lives, the things that determine who gets policed, who gets jailed, who gets protected, those things, yeah, they're kind of again not at the forefront in
Yes,
these days, unfortunately.
or largely invisible, or worse, framed as inevitable or necessary or even benevolent.
No, exactly right, Nora. Which is why today's guest is so great to bring in today. Because what Alec Karakatsanis argues, and I think this is a very, very key insight, is that a lot of what we think we know about crime, safety, and justice isn't just incomplete, it is actively constructed.
Yes, in his fabulous book, Copaganda, he lays out how media, political institutions, and what he calls the punishment bureaucracy work together to shape a very specific narrative, one where the fear of everyday people is amplified, where only certain crimes are obsessively covered, and others, like wage theft or corporate harm, barely register.
Yeah, and that imbalance isn't accidental. It drives policy, it shapes what people think the problem is and what they think the solution should be.
Which is almost always more policing, more surveillance, more punishment, especially for our most marginalized communities.
Right, and that's even when the evidence suggests that those things don't actually make people any safer.
Yeah. And one of the most haunting images from this book, Marcus, the one I can't stop thinking about, is incarcerated parents who are watching their kids write messages in chalk outside jail windows because their families can't afford the incredibly expensive phone calls from jail.
God, yeah, that is quite a harrowing image. And those messages then getting washed away by staff, just
Mm,
completely erased.
yeah. I mean, it's such a stark illustration of what he's talking about. Not just the legal system itself, but also the systems that surround our prison industrial complex, and the way that we're taught not to see those things.
Yes, and Alec is also the founder of Civil Rights Corps. He spent years challenging cash bail, debtors' prisons, and the broader architecture of mass incarceration. His work has freed hundreds of people from illegal detention as well.
Yeah, and what he's asking us to do with his book and with his broader work isn't just to critique the system. It's to interrogate the stories that we're constantly being told about that system and what our role is in repeating them.
Well, Alec, thank you so much for joining us today. Just again, just a tremendous book. I have encouraged everybody I know to read it, including some local elected officials, shall we say. So, uh, all that being said, I do want to get into it. You defined the word propaganda as a system that shapes not just how we understand crime, but what we're afraid of. So for you, what was the moment where you realized this wasn't just bias, but something systemic and intentional?
First of all, thank you so much for reading the book and for telling other people about it. I mean, that makes at least 2 people who have read it, you and my grandmother, and, and you both liked it, so that's great.
It's the quality of reader, not the quantity, Alan.
That's right, that's right. So no, I've been really incredibly inspired by all the people reading it around the country, writing me notes and letters every day about how much the book has meant to them, and especially people in prisons and in schools. Because we have a program that gives free books to anyone who wants one in prison and to any teacher who wants them for their students. And it's been really cool to get all these notes from students who are reading the book in their classes around the country. And so if you're a teacher, if you're someone who works with people in prison and you want free books, just let me know. Uh, for me, it wasn't one single moment. It was the product of working within this bureaucracy, this punishment bureaucracy in a time of mass incarceration for years and years and years that I started to become more and more aware of the pervasive nature of the mythologies and the lies that you have to tell a population while at the same time telling everyone that you're very concerned with liberty and freedom and justice, while at the same time putting a higher percentage of your population in cages than any society in the recorded history of the modern world. So, right now, we're putting people in cages at like 5 to 6 times our own steady historical rate, and 5 to 10 times other comparable countries, and 6 times the rate of South Africa at the height of apartheid for Black people. Okay. So, these are the facts, and in order to do that, to create a bureaucracy that takes 10 million people a year away from their families and schools and jobs and churches and houses of worship and loved ones and their pets who are dying because no one can take care of them, all of these, to do that to so many people, um, you have to tell the population's stories about what they're getting from all of that violence and all of those tens of billions of dollars. And so it was just a product of working within the system and seeing the extraordinary gap between what the system tells people who don't know a lot about it and who don't work in it, and what it does every day and what we see every day, those of us who do work in it. That gap, what was something I wanted to try to understand better and study and try to help ordinary people in our society confront and think about and be more critical of.
It feels like every week your book only becomes more applicable and timely, which is both an indictment of our system, but also um, praise for its relevancy. Um, I think one of the most unsettling but also important ideas in the book is that people who are tuned into the news are often becoming more misinformed or less accurately informed about crime, both in their communities and across the US. So, for readers who haven't cracked open the book yet, can you walk us through how that happens?
This is something that has been a consistent theme for people who study propaganda for many, many decades, which is that often the people who consume the most news are the most misinformed. And it actually makes sense when you start to understand that the news, and when I say the news, I'm really referring to kind of the corporate owned media. Um, it's not designed to create critically thinking, uh, deep learners. Okay, it's designed to condition people to accept, for the most part, the way that our society looks. This is the primary function of the corporate controlled media, and so the news is making really important decisions every single day out of the millions and millions and millions of things that happened last night. Somebody who works there is making a decision about which 8 to 10 things to tell you about on the nightly news, right? So the most effective propaganda is actually not things that are demonstrably false, but it's actually the selective curation of which true things to tell you. So, for example, if you told me there's a young kid who's never watched the old NBA and you want me to explain to the kid about Michael Jordan, I could make a video of Michael Jordan's career, and I could make a video of only all of his missed shots. Just miss after miss after miss after miss. It could be like a 9-hour video of Jordan missing shots. And I could show it to this kid, and this kid might conclude, well, how did this person even make it to the NBA? Um, and now these are all true anecdotes. They're all these times he missed shots, but by removing all the times he made shots, I've distorted the person's understanding of reality. And so this kid could think that maybe the greatest basketball player in history is actually a really bad basketball player, a really bad shooter. And this is what the news media does with crime. It's what the news media does with all subjects, actually. It's the selective curation of true anecdote. And for people who consume a lot of this news, often, and I talk about it in my book, it's actually often educated, intellectual, professional, liberal type people who are the most uninformed. And the research kind of shows that this is really for three reasons. Number one, they consume more news than other people. They're basing their view of the world on not on their daily interactions and the reality as much of their interpersonal reactions, but on information that is filtered through mass media. And number two, these people tend to feel the need to have an opinion on everything. And so if they want to be able to go to a cocktail party or at the water cooler at the office and have an opinion on things that they actually don't understand very deeply and don't have a lot of personal experience with. And then third, this group of people tends to believe that they are smart enough to be resilient to propaganda and that they can tell the difference between truth and lies. And so that kind of hubris actually is really a dangerous thing when combined with the other two. So in my book, I try to get people to at least understand how these phenomena are working. And most people don't realize that there's been almost 100 years of very, very rigorous research by big corporations and the government, working in collaboration with psychologists and social scientists to engage to figure out how to most effectively engage in psychological warfare. And they have very, very specific strategies. They look a little bit different in the corporate world, which is mostly about creating artificial wants to get you to think you want and need things that you actually don't, or that might even make your life ultimately or all of our collective lives worse. Such as some of the most famous examples are the corporate campaigns to get people to want to smoke more, especially women. That's been well documented and written about. But the same is true for war and for immigration and for crime and for the privatization of education and trickle down economics and all each of these areas. There's incredible scholarship on how people's reality has been distorted intentionally by creating the sense that there's just this neutral flow of news and information when in fact it's actually highly curated.
Yeah, well, Alec, I will say as a LeBron James fanatic, I won't call out the Michael Jordan propaganda here today. No, that said, I do want to stick on media for a moment, though. But prior to reading your book, I think I had less of an appreciation, right, of how both liberal and conservative media often tell, fundamentally the same story when they're talking about crime, right? We sort of have this faux um, contrast supposedly between MS Now, right, on the liberal side, and Fox News, I guess, on the right side, and yet many times it does seem like there's a shared narrative underneath. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how it's maybe when it comes to things like crime and propaganda, there's less daylight than we would think between liberal and conservative media.
My book is really about what people would call the liberal or the mainstream media. It's actually not about Fox News or Newsmax. I think right wing propaganda is extremely interesting and very effective and very important. I'm less interested in it, and it's not the focus of my book, and because um, that propaganda is obvious to most liberal people, most people who are going to read my book. They look at Fox News and they say to themselves, like my family, they might look at it and say, "Oh my gosh, that's such propaganda." Um, the only times I talk about that in my book is to show people how what's happening in the New York Times is essentially identical. It's pushing the same underlying mythologies, the same policies, very very similar outcomes. But the key difference is that it's propaganda targeted for a different audience. So it's using different framing, different sources, different words, different strategies. And so what I try to do in my book is to show people how these systems are actually propaganda in service of the same goals but for different audiences. And you have to understand that the best propagandists over the last 100 years have always understood that different strategies of propaganda are effective on different audiences. So it's actually not surprising that when you're trying to reach an audience of people who watch Rachel Maddow or who read the New York Times, you're going to use slightly different strategies than if you're trying to get Fox News viewers to adopt the same um, attitude. And so this might mean, for example, I can take one of many, many examples from my book. You might have different sources in your story because different audiences are going to find different sources credible. So if you want to get people to support the widespread expansion of police surveillance, Fox News might bring on a right wing politician or the head of the police union or the company that's about to make several $billions off the surveillance contract. And they might talk more openly about how the goal of this is to police immigrants or the poor or people of color or to make a lot of money for private enterprise. But if you are those industries and the punishment bureaucrats who really want that stuff, you're going to have a totally different strategy for New York Times viewers. You might craft your argument in terms of, oh, we need more surveillance like police cameras for accountability and transparency of the police themselves, right? And so in my study of 10 years of propaganda about police body cameras, which is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns ever run by corporate industry and the police against liberals. Um, for 10 years, after they were unsuccessful at getting billions of dollars by framing it as something that the police and prosecutors wanted, they switched to framing it as something liberals should want for police accountability. So, and it was crucial in selling that the people brought in to sell that to liberals in the mainstream news media were professors and nonprofits and Democrats, right? And so they're making the same arguments that they're making behind closed doors that we now know in right wing spaces, but they're making the same ultimate argument, but using different words and language and sources for liberals.
Right. It actually reminds me of, I think this was 2 years ago in San Francisco, which is, supposedly this a progressive bastion. uh, Voters were actually passed Proposition E, which expanded the use of surveillance by police, right? And this is, again, to your point, I mean, this is a area that's supposedly, or a city at least, that's, supposedly, capital L, liberal, and yet the people themselves voted to expand surveillance.
Well, there's a lot to be said about that, and I talk a lot in the book about the specific example of San Francisco. But a lot of these old stereotypes just aren't really true. So San Francisco is not a very progressive city right now. It's largely controlled by some of the wealthiest people in the world, and the population has become more and more um, uh, wealthy, and it's very hard for working class people to afford to live in San Francisco now. And there's basically been, contrary to the right wing mythologies created about communist San Francisco, there's been at no point in recent history has anyone who could be remotely described as progressive been in charge in San Francisco. And at the same time, there's been a multi-million dollar disinformation campaign in San Francisco in support of policing, punishment, surveillance, etc., pushing just the most outrageous and discredited misinformation about drug use, about homelessness. And all of it is essentially, I'm oversimplifying, you can read more in the book about it, but all of it is essentially making the argument that the solution to a problem like unhoused people on the street or addiction or mental illness is more investment in chains and handcuffs, guns and surveillance technology and cages to put people in, and not, for example, investment in affordable housing, investment in public health infrastructure, um, investment in early childhood education, affordable cost of living stuff. So, like, basically, it's a microcosm of what's happening all around the country, where the people who own things in our society and therefore control our government are telling people that the solution to these big social, political, economic, and cultural problems is more control and surveillance and punishment, and not more underlying investment in the root causes of those things. So that they want to essentially manage and control the inequality that is created in our society rather than solving the underlying problems of inequality. And that's where the system of policing, prosecution, and imprisonment comes in very handy for those people.
Yes, exactly. I think, getting back to sort of this propaganda that's specifically targeted at communities that would consider themselves more liberal. I think one of the things that you document really successfully in the book, and that I think I've seen very prominently in my own communities, my own family's communities, is the way that um, statistics of violence have been misused and misrepresented to create a sense that our communities are much less safe than they actually are, even when our communities have become far more safe over time. Um, and you kind of talk about how this fear is cultivated by the media and by propaganda. Um, and I wonder, so our own city of Seattle is going through some pretty agonizing conversations right now about surveillance technology, and about levels of safety in our communities. Um, I want you to prompt you to talk a little bit more about sort of how communities that have been historically under resourced or have experienced what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the kind of organized abandonment of the state, how they eventually become more open to surveillance and police centered solutions, even when they've experienced the harm of those systems.
Such an important question. I actually just was criticizing the Seattle mayor on social media the other day because she's just saying the most unhinged, like flat earther type stuff about surveillance, just reflecting either total dishonesty or not understanding how surveillance works, which is either way very troubling. And and so I think, and I had this experience when I was in Seattle for my book event, which was a really fun, exciting event. I mean, hundreds of people came out. It was an incredible conversation. I it was really cool to also learn about the ways in which people and ordinary people in Seattle are fighting back. And I think I'll say a couple of things. Number one, people's support for more punishment and surveillance is a lot weaker than we are led to believe in the mainstream news. I have a chapter on this in the book, but I expanded on it more recently in some essays. But um, it you cannot trust most stories and polling on these questions because the way you ask people the question completely determines their answer. And it turns out that over the last several decades, when you ask people what they want for their safety, they in huge supermajorities, and this is true from Democrats to Independents and Republicans, they prefer moving resources away from the punishment system and investing in healthcare, housing, and education. Supermajorities prefer this. Now, some of the propaganda has vilified certain terminology like quote unquote defund the police. So when you ask people just about defund the police, it is very unpopular because um, uh, polling always depends on what context and what information you give people. So if you actually ask people, do you want to shift some of the budgets of the police, prosecution, and prison and local jail to these other services? They say overwhelmingly yes. But if you ask them without giving any context or defining the term, do you want to defund the police? They say no. So these things are much more complex. And they're also heavily determined by not just statistics, but the weaponization of anecdotes. So one thing that happens a lot is um, there will be news coverage of particular crimes at particular moments that are used to make people think that crime is rising. And we see this in particular around election time and et cetera. But over the last 25 years in most of the country, polls have showed people think crime is going up. And over the same period of time, almost every single year, crime has been going down to the point where we have the lowest recorded crime rates in US history right now, at least in recorded US history. And how does this happen? Well, in many, many ways I describe in the book, but one key one is that just by doing more stories about crime, you can make people think crime is going up. So you could have a city like Seattle, and maybe there's fewer murders than there were the previous year, but maybe twice as many news stories about murder. And if you see twice as many news stories, you're going to just think that murder is up and you're going to feel that way. And the same is true of retail theft and carjacking and all these other crimes. So that's how you manipulate anecdote. And then with statistics, like this is one thing I've documented that's quite funny. The news media has this habit of like when they report statistics, they'll pick like the worst one. So they'll say something like robberies in Seattle are up 19% over last year. And setting aside even the problems of trying to do like year over year comparisons and all the data problems, which I also talk about in the book, um, that's often comical because that same data will show that sexual assault and murder and property crime are all down. So they pick the one thing that's up, and so but maybe next year, maybe sexual assaults are up, but everything else is down, and the headline will be sexual assaults are up, and so they never tell people that all the other things are down. And so there's so many different strategies that are employed by the policing public relations industry, and I say industry because most people are totally unaware that everything you see and hear about this stuff is carefully selected and curated by a multi-billion-dollar industry. That I'm in New York City right now. There are 90 full-time public relations cops at the NYPD, manipulating what you see and hear every day on social media, on the mainstream news. In Chicago, when the police killed Laquan McDonald, they had 4 full-time PR people. Now, over a decade later, they have over 50 in Chicago alone. I'm not even talking about all the PR people who work for prosecutors and sheriffs and the jails and the mayor's office. I'm just talking about the police department. The police unions have their own teams. There's private companies that are contracted. So this ecosystem is so vast. The Los Angeles sheriff has 42, just the sheriff, 42 full-time PR officers. So I don't know what the numbers are in Seattle, and one of the reasons is that in most cities the police don't release this information in the budget, so the public has no idea actually how much of policing resources are actually being used to manipulate how we think about crime.
Yeah, I if you could stay on this line of questioning for a moment because it what I've seen throughout the years as a journalist, and I'm sure you have as well, is you talked earlier about the weaponization of anecdotes, and I'll say particularly here in Seattle, there were situations where there were high profile shootings at high schools. There was actually, as we record this, there was just a shooting yesterday at a in a park of two teenagers, and sort of almost immediately after, there's this there's this rush in the news to say, "Oh well, this is another example of why we need these cameras." Are the victims of the families of the victims of this shooting say that they want more cameras, they want more police, and I always think how just almost sort of I don't like trauma porn that is, in the sense of like you are going and asking somebody what they want in the worst moment of their life, right? In the sense of that they are traumatized by the death of a loved one or shooting that just happened. And I'm not at all trying to dismiss this pain, right? But you're not exactly thinking the most rationally at that moment, right? And yet you are asking them what they want, right, for public safety. And so I want to ask you, like, how can we as folks who are trying to build towards a better society and less of a carceral state, how do we, I guess, counterbalance that? Like, how do we actually, yes, we address and understand that people are going through a very traumatic situation, but then also, right, continue to fight for things that are alternatives to a carceral state and a surveillance state.
Well, what you're describing is actually a very sophisticated and common propaganda tactic where the desires of marginalized people, or in this case, it's often black and brown people or immigrant communities or very poor communities. um, their subjective desires are completely ignored in our political process unless and until they express some view that is consistent with what the people in power want, in which case they are weaponized against the rest of those communities. I give some really chilling examples of this. The example I give in my book on this exact question actually comes from Seattle and from NPR's police reporter, who is one of the worst Copaganda offenders in the country. just an awful, awful propagandist who was spewing all kinds of pro-police content for many years, and he did the exact same thing in Seattle for some of his stories, where you essentially you go and you interview poor people, people of color, people in heavily policed communities, and you don't report what many of them are saying, and until you find someone who says the thing that you want them to say, which is we want more police, we want more surveillance cameras, and there are many, many, many victims and survivors of police violence who don't say that. Those people are those are not the people that the police then connect with the news media. So the story that makes its way to news consumers is that, oh my goodness, the family of this police shooting victim or the family of this other crime desperately wants more surveillance for police to control. When in fact, the previous three or four families who had that happen to them most certainly didn't want that. They preferred more investment in their community. They preferred what the evidence shows actually reduces violence in their community, not more control in the hands of police. And so um, this is a very sophisticated tactic because it's a lot harder to speak out against the victim of police violence. And the police understand this. This is why they put forward the victims of violence who support the police point of view. And they are often brutally ruthless and rude and threatening to the families of victims that don't support the police narrative. So it's
Have you been to a Seattle City Council meeting that like is you painted a precise picture of that. But anyway, sorry.
I have never been to a Seattle City Council meeting, but I can tell you that you're not alone. This is the playbook that the police use all over the country.
Well, and not to mention that, like, the other side of the story that no one is hearing about are the many people who are in jail or incarcerated who have been targeted and unfairly sort of prosecuted by these systems. I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about how, if at all, you've seen um, city leadership and citizens grappling with some of the concerns about the biases of these surveillance systems, and what you see as better reforms for our communities that would not continue to disproportionately police and punish our most marginalized.
The most important thing to remember, and this is something I talk about a lot in my first book, Usual Cruelty, and in this second book, Copaganda, is we should not be supporting any reform that gives more size, power, money, technology to the policing bureaucracy. The things that we need to be focused on are reducing the extent to which our society tries to solve or to say it's solving social problems through punishment and state violence. And instead, we should be investing in the things that people need in their daily life to live a better life. Things like early childhood education, treatment and medical care, places to live, um, solutions to the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that is happening, right? Um, there's all kinds of evidence now about the links between various environmental toxins like lead and crime, toxic masculinity, and all of the different cultural forces that affect how much we hurt each other. This is overwhelming evidence. This it's when people push the idea of more cops and more surveillance. This is like climate science denial. It's like flat earther thinking. It's completely divorced from all of the available evidence. And so what we've seen in communities around the country is when you can focus on the evidence and start building some of these alternative ways of taking care of each other, whether it's crisis response teams that aren't through the police department, where you're working with nurses and doctors and home healthcare workers and other public health workers, um, or you're doing other kinds of programming in school, or you're building places where young people can come and hang out and be with each other and do fun things. Like these are the kinds of things that work and that communities love, and that are a much better use of resources than a multi-million-dollar contract with a new surveillance company that the police want. And so I've found that when you actually have real public dialogue and more specificity on what exactly the police are spending their money on, and you force them in public to start justifying this, and you talk about the actual evidence, and you show people with real examples in their community of what else you could be doing with this money, people overwhelmingly prefer to spend their money on things that actually make people's lives better. And that's been really encouraging to see all over the country. And at the end of my book, Copaganda, I give a list of all these questions that you can ask your own city council person and all of these things that you can do in your own community that might help with this.
Well, we will definitely be in conversation in this city around your book. I will say, and Alec, Jen, again, just thank you so very much for your time, for your work, and for your words today. It's all meaningful. So thank you.
Well, I'm so glad to be in touch with you guys again, and I'm really grateful that you enjoyed the book.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing I want to say is I don't make any money from any of my books. All of the royalties are donated to an incredible group that works with unhoused people to fight against police surveillance. So
Mm.
get the book, and you can, if you get 10 or more books, you can get a 40% off
Okay.
at the publisher's website. So you don't need to support any large online book retailers if you don't want to. And
Well, sounds like
I
we
really
can,
hope.
get copies for the entire Seattle City Council then.
Yes, you should. You should. I can get you set up with a 40% discount.
They don't worry. They can afford to pay full price. Like I gotta say.
All right, great.
Thank you. Well, Nora, I will say like, one of the things that stands out about Alec's work to me is the fact that it's made me, quite frankly, just re-examine how I'm being propagandized, right? In the sense
Mhm.
that he talks about how, I mean, this is a book, quite frankly, that's written for folks who are on the liberal spectrum or are left of center in terms of how we even eh, relate and discuss these conversations around public safety, and the fact
Mhm.
that when we're tuning in all the time to whether it's CNN or MS Now or reading the New York Times or what have you, how often we're left sort of with these residue of very, quite frankly, conservative and carceral messages around um, public safety that ultimately don't necessarily do us any good.
Yeah, yeah, and the conversation also provides this really interesting through line to the conversation we had with Anand Pandyan maybe a month or 2 ago
Mm,
about, how we live in these, like, largely walled off lives, and
yes.
I think there's such an interesting link between people being constantly told that they are not safe, right, through the kind of propaganda that Alec is talking about, and then people creating these very walled existences that then
Right.
reinforce that feeling of unsafety, but also separate us from each other.
Absolutely. And I just been thinking about the conversation that we're having here locally in Seattle, where we both live, about surveillance cameras and whether or not they keep folks safe. And I've been privy to some of the conversations in areas where black and brown folks live, and seeing sort of the division in
Yeah.
you know f- some folks wanting them, some folks not, some folks who have, quite frankly, been traumatized by
Yeah.
recent shootings and asking for cameras. And I think having, as I was talking to another journalist friend of mine, he was saying how hard he feels it is to have conversations where you're like, you know what, this doesn't, these cameras don't actually keep you safe in this, in this moment where these people have these very high intense emotions,
Yeah.
and they've been, they felt, and right, justifiably so, that they haven't been paid attention to for the longest time. And so the only thing that they feel they have an option of is either more policing or more surveillance. And in those times where they're very much sort of emotionally charged, they're willing to select these options that in the short term might make them feel better, but in the long term, are probably not beneficial. Not probably, that aren't beneficial to our communities.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've been trying to get Alec to come on the podcast for quite a while. He's a busy guy.
Yes.
But I couldn't be more glad that he came on this week because it feels so relevant to conversations that we're having right now in our city. Also, knock knock, Mayor Katie, are you there? Are you
I I as I told another friend, like, I don't mind folks who deliberate and then make the right decision. Mind you deliberating and not making the right decision. So,
or deliberating with the wrong information. I
that
feel
is
like she
also
hasn't done the reading on this one. And I know she's a super smart person, so
yeah.
I don't yeah,
We'll send her this, we'll send her this, this podcast. I
perfect.
will say just real quickly for a takeaway for folks, when I interviewed Alec, for another story, he said that the best way he felt of, avoiding propaganda is actually doing long form reading of
Yes.
whether it's academic style journals or academic style articles, but stuff where it isn't just strictly, you're trying to a reporter's trying to make a deadline. Let me get a both sidesism type thing, and
Yeah,
then let me file this. So
yeah.
do the
Or
reading,
maybe
folks.
long
Do the
form
reading.
listening, Marcus.
That also, right? I mean, we'll do the reading for you, and you just listen to us. Anyhow, shall we shall we get into our 8 ounces of joy for this week?
Let's do it. Do you wanna go first, Marcus?
I will. Mine is kind of a simple thing, but it was pretty cool. So this is actually last Sunday, I believe. I was on the Seattle Reddit thread for my neighborhood in Beacon Hill, and
Okay.
there were yeah.
Something good happened on Reddit?
That was
Sorry.
I know that setup was a
I'm like,
little
"Where
little
is this
ominous, I guess.
going?"
But, but I there was a post about, I think it was about, I think it was ended up being about around 7 people who, were stuck for a few moments in the elevator in the Beacon Hill, light rail station, and they had, taken a photo and everybody was smiling, and you saw all these strangers, right, from our, from our neighborhood, and it truly looked like the part of Seattle I live in where it was, racially diverse, gender diverse, and
Yeah,
so on and so forth. And people are just smiling, and they're stuck in this elevator for 15 minutes to a half hour, and folks are just, you know, they're talking to each other, they're getting to know each other, they're like within this sort of uh, pop-up community, if you will. And
yeah,
yes, it was unfortunate that it took a elevator stoppage for that to happen, and it could have been scary, obviously. And thankfully, they were able to get them out, um, without too much hassle. But at the same time, it was just cool to see folks, at the, just, coming together and in sort of this, making the best out of the situation. It didn't descend into a Lord of the Flies situation in this elevator. And I think it's always good to sort of highlight, when we are at our best and acting, with humanity and grace for folks in
yeah.
situations where, particularly, I'm not gonna lie, there's been times where I've been in that elevator and it's been 6 o'clock and I pooped from the day and I was probably not the best version of myself. And somebody probably would have got cussed out if they had said something too slick or something. So I just wanted to say that to say it was great that you had people, all there in what could have been a fairly tense situation, be the best versions of themselves, and to make the best of it, and have an opportunity to have a, I guess, flash fun squad in the elevator. So there you go.
Yes. I also, I just love the idea of these people having, like, a group chat afterwards. It's like the elevator survival group chat of Beacon Hill. Um no, those, like, messy human connections are truly, like, what it's all about, especially in this day and age.
Those are the best. Those are the best. How about you though, Nora? What was your 8 ounces of joy this week?
Okay, well, shout out to Hungary, first of all.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not just that Viktor Orban was defeated, which was great, but did you see the partying that happened afterwards?
I did see the partying, yes.
It was unreal. I mean, it was not just, like, people hitting the streets, it was like they had these parties organized. Like, they'd
Yes,
been planning
yes.
these for a while, and there was something
16 years, in
about
fact, for some
yes,
people, yeah.
but, like, there was something about it that just, like, gave me so much hope and joy
Yeah,
because not only were they planning to win, they were planning to party afterwards, and
yes,
I feel like we need more of that energy here in the US, that not just is this time going to come to an end at some point, not we don't know when, but it
right.
will, but also, like, let's spend some time, like, party planning for it. Get your fireworks ready.
I think that's where we need to put I mean, other than the midterms, I think that's where we need to put our energy, right now. Is like, let's move forward with, like, the day after this, the day after
Exactly,
the
envision the
election where this
party.
is going. Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
I will not I will not douse your joy with the fact that they, essentially, they went from an autocrat to I guess a social conservative over there in
hey,
that
you know
country,
what?
but you know what? We'll take it. We'll take
One
it.
step at a time.
That is true. That is true. Anyhow, well, with that, Nora, shall we go ahead and sign off for this week?
Yeah, we'd better. Well, folks, it has been another week of America speed running its own unraveling. But hey, if we made you laugh once or think twice or briefly forget about our national self immolation, then I think we've done our job, or at least distracted you long enough to survive the next news cycle.
And just a quick reminder that this podcast has been powered for 47 straight weeks by you. No shadowy billionaires, no weird supplement ads, just listeners with taste and a mild tolerance for chaos. So, if you liked what you heard, please share it. And if you really liked it, head to inthemeanwhile.com and donate. Shout out to Kathleen, whose generosity this past week secured us a truly humbling quarter tank of gas in our hybrids. Yes, we are exactly that Pacific Northwest.
Yes. And as always, huge love to our producer, Jessica Partnow, for making us sound far more competent and coherent than we actually are week after week. And to Aham Aluo for the music that single handedly stops this from sounding like two nerds raging into the void.
And you can catch In the Meanwhile Wednesdays at 5 p.m. on KVRU or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow us on Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and basically anywhere that hasn't fully rebranded itself as a digital town square for those nostalgic for the Third Reich who are cosplaying as free speech absolutists.
Gosh, Marcus, I can't imagine who you're talking about.
Let's
All
just throw
right.
that out there. Hypothetical. Hypothetical.
New episodes drop every Friday, folks. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Try not to let the chaos convince you it's normal. We will catch you in the meanwhile.